Welcome to our first ethics roundtable this year. We're so excited that we're going to be looking at the ethical considerations in the nonprofit sector. I'd like to just begin by welcoming everybody. I'm Tracy Gonzalez-Padron, the director of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative Collegiate Program at UCCS in the College of Business. Also, I am a professor in the College of Business, and that's how I have the pleasure of working with Lauren Hallaron, who is also an instructor in the College of Business in Management. Lauren is a UCCS Ethics Fellow and worked with an ethics student ambassador on presenting ethical considerations in a new class on nonprofit management. So let's hear from Lauren, and we will begin.
Thanks everybody for being here this morning. First, I want to say thanks to the Daniels Fund for supporting this fellowship and our work with our College of Business students in the area of ethics development. And also, I'd like to thank my student ambassador, Michaela Herring, who I don't think is on this morning, but she worked with me all last semester, making sure that everything was prepped and ready to go. That's me. Hi. So in addition to working at the College of Business and participating in this fellowship last year, I'm also the executive director of a nonprofit here in Colorado Springs called Alternative Global Entrepreneurs. So what I'd love to do today is give you a little bit of an overview of how I got into the interest of ethics, what I've seen happen in my professional career outside of teaching, talk a little bit about why I think that's really important in the nonprofit sector, and give you an idea of what kind of content we created for students so that when they come out of the program and out with their degree, that they're ready to enter the workplace and hopefully have a better understanding of what to do and what to expect when things maybe don't go as planned. Okay, so first, as a way of a brief introduction, I want to give you this background information on how I became so acutely aware of the need for ethics training and my personal experience seeing how things can get really messy when people choose to act unethically. So shortly after grad school, I was working as a consultant in the international development sector. That's my primary expertise area there. And my main role here was to help organizations evaluate the long-term results of their programs. So I was working on everything from survey designs to data collection, impact reporting, and things like that. And during this time, I was also volunteering with a small nonprofit organization here in the Springs that was teaching entrepreneurship to young artisans in developing countries. So entrepreneurship is something I'm deeply passionate about because research has really taught us that it's the way to help develop an economy and lift people out of poverty, and without just giving them stuff, but helping them actually find work and earn a living. So even though the organization was small, they were growing. They were led by a really compelling young visionary executive director that founded the organization about 5 years prior. And at inception, the company was a for-profit company. So they traditionally had brought back artisan goods and would sell them at things like farmers markets and the like. And every time the founder would come back from a trip, she'd bring things with her and sell them at these places. So in order to basically provide jobs abroad, right? So eventually the program grew and began to include business training, and a nonprofit entity with the same name, the same main name was formed. So there were essentially two companies being run by the same person here. One was a for-profit LLC that brought back goods and sold things, and another was a 501c3 that raised funds through donations and events in order to put on these business trainings in poor countries. So ideally, the for-profit firm would have enough funding by selling all these goods to fund the nonprofit to donate it back, and that would provide a more sustainable method of funding. Like, super ideal, that'd be great. But when the founder began looking to hire an operations director, that's kind of where I come into play in this story. She was looking to combine, both the efforts of both organizations and entities here, and I thought that's a great way for me to get involved while still being able to stay in the Colorado Springs area and working within my passion area of interest here. So once I got in the door there, however, things quickly took a turn as I began to discover how convoluted the organization's operations were. So I'm going to walk us through what I discovered, and then we're going to brainstorm together what you think should have happened. Okay, so the first thing that I came across when I got in the door was a drawer full of letters and invoices from the IRS for unpaid payroll taxes. So with back taxes and fines, the amount owed was a little over $50,000. They hadn't been paid in, I think, maybe like 5 or 6 years, at which point we quickly hired an enrolled agent with the IRS to get the Oregon payment plan and get our accounts current. And then I discovered even more problems when the founder went on sabbatical and turned over all the passwords to financial accounts and the payroll account. And as it turned out, this was the very same month that we went into the red and were unable to make payroll. So probably the most problematic, however, was the extent to which the accounts were enmeshed and the misappropriation of donor funding that was going on. So there was a lot of ways in which the nonprofit was essentially funding the artisan market, which, if you remember, is an LLC. It's owned by the founder. So in order to buy products or things from the artisans in other countries, the nonprofit credit card was used in that case. That's the same credit card was also used to make payments for non-business expenses and a family trip that the founder took to Mexico. So payroll also had been traditionally run out of the nonprofit, even though all of the employees were essentially doing work up to 50% of the time at the for-profit company, again, owned as an LLC. So nonprofit donors and grantors were funding the payroll of employees that worked for the founder's, essentially her personal company. So everything was enmeshed. Even the social media accounts were shared as one channel, because again, they had that shared name, which doesn't just make like marketing and branding difficult, because who are we marketing and branding to? But it also meant that all of our entities were very like convoluted and enmeshed together. So essentially, we've got the for-profit firm taking from the nonprofit, and the nonprofit taking from the employees without withholding their payroll taxes and not paying those on their behalf. And all of this that was going on wasn't just unethical, but it was illegal, allegedly. So you tell me here, what do you think that you would do in this case? What's the ethical thing to do if you're in my shoes? You get in the door thinking everything's on the up and up, and all of a sudden, everything comes undone, but you're still really passionate about the mission. You think this is the right way forward. The products that we have are great, but what's happening internally, because we've got this amazing founder with amazing vision that doesn't necessarily have any kind of business training or business degree, things have just gotten really messy and really unethical. What do we do? I'm going to open that up to you guys to say, what do you think I should have done here? If you know anything about how nonprofits are built and run and who runs those organizations, feel free to jump in. I don't have controls over pointing to people, so maybe you can do that for us, Tracy. Or you guys can just unmute.
Yeah, go ahead and unmute if you want to.
You can leave it. Oh yeah, you're good. You're on the right side. Sorry. Anybody have a step one?
So Lauren, I'm thinking initially that attention needs to be called to the situation, especially where the owner's concerned.
Sure.
Awareness.
Sure. Who are we gonna make aware? Are we talking about donors? Are we talking about the public? Are we talking about?
Oh, I'm thinking initially the owner, because, you know, just bringing some attention, because I think part of a problem is helping somebody fix it. And so bringing that person in to take responsibility and ownership of the issue, and, you know, through that awareness, and then kind of mapping out a plan along with that owner would be very helpful.
Great. Absolutely. Who else has something?
And Jessica says in the chat, inform the board.
Inform the board.
She can explain that further.
Oh, sorry there. No, just to inform the board of what you're learning, maybe in conjunction with the owner. But I would say before you decide to take any steps forward, that the board needs to be fully engaged and aware, and they need to be ultimately involved with the decision making as well, and in terms of how that affects the nonprofit.
Excellent. Okay, so in nonprofits, different from a for-profit entity is the organization is basically thought of to be owned by the public. And so in order to keep accountability of the organization using public good or public money for a social good, it has a board of directors, and the board of directors essentially is who's ultimately in control and has the fiduciary responsibility of the organization. So that's a combination of what both of you ladies have said already, is kind of exactly how this unfolded. Originally went to the founder. Some of this came out before sabbatical, but when you're dealing with like burnout and situations like that on sabbatical, you go to the board and you say, hey, that's what I say. Is this like normal for us? Is this a cash flow issue? Are we just maybe in the red for a few days because donations come in at the end of the month, payroll rolls in the middle? What's the deal, right? They should have the information and access to accounts. That's there's usually like a treasurer on the board that has all of that information. So step one, exactly right. That's exactly what I did. I'll roll out step two and let me know what you think we should do from there. So we go to the board, we hand over all the documents. Here's what we got, what's going on. They say, we have no idea. We have no access to any financial documentation or any of the accounts, the Amex account, the IRS account, the bank accounts, the donor accounts, any of those things. So what they had been given was basically, Excel reports printed out for board meetings created by the founders and executive directors. So they said, oh no, we don't know. Let's get into it. Anybody have any guess of what happened next? What should the board do at this point, now that they're getting into it and recognizing like there might be some problems here?
Well, were there any, I'm just wondering if there were any bylaws that were created that.
Yes, indeed, there are bylaws, and you have to file them with the Secretary of State along with your articles of incorporation when you start the nonprofit. That doesn't mean that they're being followed, as we come to find out. But yes, there are
Right.
bylaws that that lay out the plan for how many officers there are, who needs to be on accounts, and those kinds of things. All right, I'll give some more details here. So originally what happens is about half the board resigns. They head for the hills. I don't blame them. And we hire an attorney, because that seemed to be the next course of action, is that the board would hire an attorney. They opened all board meetings to the public to increase transparency. And as we all know, having worked with Daniel's Fund, that's one of the founding principles here, is we need accountability and transparency. And so we open up all the board meetings to the public and to staff and to everyone to know exactly what's going on there, because at this point, the founder's been notified. We've tried to make some plans to rectify things, but it's not going well. So the attorney's advice, aside to me personally, which was quit, run, do what they did, distance yourself, was basically that we have to be accountable to those debts that we owed, which means that everyone on the board has a responsibility for that. And that would include, at this point, up to around $100,000 either of debt or ways that like funds were misappropriated, things were mishandled. So we've got a couple options. We can either go back to our donors and say, hey, donors, we need to raise at least $50,000 to pay off the debts that we owe on the nonprofit side. The for-profit had kind of had their debts enmeshed with ours, right? Because their credit card was being used, the nonprofit credit card was being used to buy things for the marketplace. So we could try and get the for-profit to pay us back, but it didn't really have the funds to be able to do so, or to pay for any of the employee time that was taken, those kinds of things either. So let's see, we've got the attorney saying go. The organization basically at this point can't really make a comeback because we received a letter from the IRS saying they're coming to seize our assets in 2 weeks. So we've got 2 weeks to figure out what to do here because it had gotten so out of control. Ultimately, the decision was made to close the organization and sell off all the assets so that we could send whatever we had left to the IRS. The way that the credit card company typically works is you have to open that as a small business, as an individual person. So whether you're for-profit or nonprofit, the credit card company is opening that in the name of an individual. So it was still in the name of the founder executive director. So we chose to leave that one behind for her to deal with as the for-profit company, because she will maintain ownership of the for-profit company moving forward, and that'll stay open. We couldn't access any way to let our donors know if we wanted to do fundraisers or something to try and save the organization, because we were locked out of all the social media accounts and things since they were also all shared. As far as like rent in the building that we were in, we let the landlord know, and there wasn't a whole lot to be done there to try and salvage it. So we sold all of the fixtures, the office supplies, the copy machines, all of those kinds of things, and then set about looking for a buyer for the program, because the curriculum that had been developed over the time was still really useful and really valuable. But I don't know if you all are very familiar with operations of nonprofits, but we typically set our budgets a year ahead of time. And so in order to try and get funding, an organization would have to have a lot of cash on hand to be able to do those kinds of things, which just wasn't feasible for most of the organizations that we talked about to be able to do that in the amount of time and turnaround needed. So what we ended up doing was selling everything. I had found 2 donors that were interested in seeing the program continue, that agreed to donate to be able to purchase the curriculum. And we sold it to the New Horizons Foundation. So New Horizons Foundation is in town here. They basically operate as a fiscal sponsor for projects. So if somebody wanted to do a project but didn't have the business know-how or wherewithal to start their own nonprofit, you could go to a company like that that operates as a fiscal sponsor, and they take care of your office back end, your payroll, your accounting. You have to basically just submit receipts to be reimbursed for everything. You don't have a separate bank account, those kinds of activities. And they also have an attorney on staff and are run by a very responsible board of directors. So we decide to take our donors over there, allow them to basically donate to a project to be opened in the name of this like entrepreneurship training, and then be able to get that curriculum, send all of those funds to the IRS, close up shop, try and salvage any donor relationships that we could, but donors were very disenfranchised with the organization, understandably. All right, so we started as a project under New Horizons Foundation, and we're able to really like pick up on the projects that were due. We had a couple of like trips that had already been sold, people that had hired the nonprofit essentially to come complete entrepreneurship training in other countries that had paid deposits, that also we felt an obligation and an ethical obligation to like deliver on those things. So the staff, the board stayed on as volunteers and like supporters of the organization, but we hired a whole new advisory board. New Horizons has their own actual board of directors, but we wanted to have our own advisory board and people who are involved and committed to the project. So we set about recruiting very specific skills. And instead of having friends on the board, they were all people who we didn't really have friendships with, but we knew had specific skills to bring to the table, and were invested in seeing the organization succeed and the mission continue. We also switched the model at this point. Instead of being like donor-based and trying to raise money to do everything or have products to sell, we went to a licensing model where we partner with other organizations and essentially license curriculum for them to be able to implement this in their own communities, which allowed actually for the expansion of it really rapidly, because other organizations don't have the funds or know how to really create a business training from scratch, but we can kind of outsource that to them. And then eventually, about 3 years later, we were able to file for our own 501c3 under Alternative Global Entrepreneurs. So we've got 2 now ways that we can apply for grant funding or do different things, either as a project with a fiscal sponsor that runs all of our payroll and all of that still runs through there. Or if someone wanted to grant us as an organization, an individual grant, we have a 501c3 now to be able to accept those funds as well. I got to see firsthand coming out really how messy and tricky ethics can be when we think it's actually quite simple. And it didn't really leave a great taste in my mouth, to be honest. Like, I wanted to work on ethics in the nonprofit sector as part of this program with the Daniels Fund, because this is the sector that's supposed to represent our highest ideals, our hopes for the future, right? Nonprofits are working hard to solve the problems of the world and to help the most vulnerable people and creatures on the planet. So if they're trying to represent these ideals outwardly, then the organization needs to hold those values internally. No one's going to believe in your organization if you're running around doing unethical / illegal things, but you're saying like, hey, we're trying to help people. So all of our values have to come from within the organization first, and then it's going to be easy to promote them outwardly. We want to be consistent with who we are as an organization. So I believe that ethics should dictate how we do our work and how we choose to accomplish our mission. And that includes not just how the organization conducts its programs, but how they represent themselves and their clients and their beneficiaries, how they interact with the community, and how they prioritize their donor funding is all influenced by ethics. So from the outside, being ethical, as I talk to my students about, like, it might seem easy. You think like, hey, I have strong ethics, I have strong convictions, but we all know in certain situations, it's maybe not that simple. You might say like, I would never steal. I'm not a thief, even just a loaf of bread, right? But if you're Jean Valjean and your family's starving, people come to different conclusions under pressure. So we all like to believe that we're ethical, but making poor decisions isn't uncommon to the human experience. It's probably something we've all experienced and regretted at some point. And in the case of nonprofits, it's something that tends to get these justifications that we see taking place to excuse poor ethical decision making. So I really wanted our students to understand how this happens and to be able to make different decisions moving forward when they come across them in their careers. So in the case of nonprofits, there's no shortage of these justifications that we see when we're trying to change the world. So nonprofit organizations are no strangers to bad publicity and public scandal. And in fact, due to the nature of nonprofits, unethical behavior is more common in the nonprofit sector than in the for-profit arena. And there's several reasons why we think nonprofits are especially vulnerable to fraud compared with the for-profit sector. So they include things like lack of resources, poor internal controls, inadequate training, high turnover with low employee investment, poor technology resources. All of these factors that we saw at play in the case study can be at play in organizations on the day-to-day. Sometimes they're just operating on a shoestring budget with some kind of skeleton crew and a bunch of volunteers, which means they're less likely to have the means and know-how to even protect themselves than larger for-profit or even larger nonprofit-driven enterprises. Limited operating budgets that they have are likely to be earmarked for core personnel and publicity. So employee turnover is obviously a big part of the problem. According to the 2015 Nonprofit Employment Practices Survey, turnover among nonprofit entities rose from 16% to 19%, which is unfortunate but understandable. So if the pay is lower and the workload is frequently more grueling than the for-profit sector, it's really hard to get good people to stay. It's one of the reasons why I advocate for like fair wages and higher pay in the nonprofit sector overall, because if we can't keep good people on board, then oftentimes we're just kind of left with what people have the privilege to be able to volunteer for our organization, which doesn't mean that they necessarily have the skill or the know-how or capacity to make these difficult ethical decisions when it happens. So we might deal with more things like people stealing money for personal use or embezzlement, misappropriating funds. So misappropriating funds is usually also for personal use. And other issues that we see really commonly in the industry are nepotism, where we hire unqualified family members to do work for the org because they're willing to come do it for us. They believe in us. They believe in our mission. We might have a conflict of interest where someone gains an unfair advantage or has different incentives than doing what's best for the organization. And all of these things can contribute to problems for us. So let's take a look at some headlines here. Tracy, if you'll hit next. Again, you might expect to see this type of behavior from smaller, less professional organizations. Here's one local from the Springs, but the size and scope of unethical behavior in the nonprofit sector scales to even the most notable and newsworthy stories, like the Trump and Clinton foundations. Here we've got some headlines in the news from both of those. To slide 9, we even have the Wounded Warrior Project, really well-known organization we think of as a reputable firm. Even they were caught up in different kinds of scandals in the news. And these are some of the just top headlines of the news. We've got Liberty University here. We've got the NRA. It happens at all levels within the sector in any size organization. It's not just the small ones. And here, the goal of this Daniels Fund Fellowship project that I had last year was really to bring ethics training and education to this specific sector. So I teach a course on business government society here in the College of Business as well. And we talk about ethics with our students already. And I wanted to make sure we're expanding in the realm of nonprofit business classes and business training, that they also have that foundation here. So last spring, I launched a new course called Introduction to Nonprofit Management, where we're able to explore the skills necessary to working in that field and the way our students can apply what they've been creating in all of their other classes to create more impact in the world around them, locally, internationally, and the ways that fuel their passions. The founding principles of the Daniels Fund were the underlying guide to teaching our students here throughout the course how to conduct themselves and their organizations ethically. So in order to build an ethical organization, we've got to conduct ourselves with integrity, acting with honesty in all situations. So it's not appropriate to lie or cheat our clients or donors or even our employees. We also have to trust in all of our stakeholder relationships within the nonprofits. This can be more complicated as our customers are usually not the ones paying the bill for their goods or services. But we learned how building trust can tie in with the principle of transparency, that we have to be transparent with our plans and our spending, especially because the money that we're spending in nonprofits is not our own, but that of our donors and our funders. If we just started a company on our own, typically we're investing our own money. We're taking that risk ourselves, but here we're taking the risk with somebody else's money. So that also means we need to be accountable to that, which means we have to be responsible for our decisions and how we report to the board of directors to maintain that accountability. So throughout the course, we focused on fairness, which is often a top priority in the nonprofit sector, right? We want everyone to have equal opportunities and just relationships. So we want to make sure that this isn't just applying to making sure that our employees are paid fairly, but that we're serving our marginalized communities well, that they have all of the same fairness and justness that every level of the organization is demonstrating. That means, like, baked into our operations, we should also honor and respect the rights and freedoms and views and property of others. We did things in class like just learn how to file our basic agency's legal documents and the laws that govern our operations. We talked about in order to accomplish the mission of the organization, we have to operate and focus on viability and long-term health of the organization. So that might mean if we're doing something and it's not working, that we have to pivot, we have to change, we have to raise money differently or find different sources of funding. And all of these principles were really woven throughout the topics, ranging from budgeting and marketing and fundraising and strategic planning and board governance. We wove in each of the Daniels Fund principles throughout the class. Okay, so after spending much of the semester focused on how to utilize our skills and raise money and cultivate relationships to solve the world's biggest issues of the day, I wanted to make sure that my students would go on to be strong leaders capable of making tough decisions. So I didn't want them to just be like passionate about their cause, but know how to build a strong ethical organization or to look for one when they enter the job market, because a lot of times I might not have seen the things ahead of time that entered into my case. I didn't have access to those things. If we ask really good questions, potentially I could have seen some of those things and known them ahead of time. So briefly, I want to touch on a few of the topics that we covered so you can get an idea of the kind of things that we focused on. So I'm just going to highlight some of these things that we covered. We won't get into all of it. We did a special week just on essentially what is good ethics. And there's lots of ways to make correct ethical choices. And we'll go over some of those things that we talked about here. And then I've got a couple questions for us at the end that we can discuss, the students discussed, and see if we come up with the same ideas and answers. So we talked about the different philosophies on how we make ethical choices. And we get into a lot of those in my BGSO course. So rather than doing that again, I simplified it down to these 2 core ideas. Number 1, treating others the way you want to be treated, thinking about what you need to do or accomplish, and then weighing your options and looking at what you want done if you're on the receiving end of your decision. You know, very golden rule here. We know it doesn't just apply to how we treat our clients and our donors, but our colleagues, our direct reports, our board of directors. We just have maybe a few more different kinds of stakeholders involved in the process day to day in the nonprofit world than the for-profit does. We also talked about if we would want what decision we're making to be heard about and known by others, and that doing the right thing is also the smart thing and vice versa. So can we build an ethical culture within our organization at which people feel valued and heard and they're willing to be loyal to? Was really important to our discussion. And even though doing the right thing is also the smart thing, this can sometimes be a little trickier for here. So if we're trying to get things done and we care obviously about the mission and our final beneficiary on the receiving end, whoever that may be, it might be really tempting to take a shortcut or try and get them as many services as we possibly can, but we won't want to do that at the expense of someone else or another stakeholder that we have. So lots of times what we're dealing with isn't necessarily illegal, but it can lead to bad results and a poor reputation for our organization if we become known as really not taking care of our donors or our employees. That cannot be good for us either, as we get a bad reputation in the community. But comparatively, when we back up our staff and our people and we give them the opportunity and freedom to see the best long-term results, they're going to be confident in their smart decisions, which is going to breed a higher level of accountability. And as our reputation goes, we should have more funding to do all the things that we want to do in the first place. We also learned that it's really important to instill our company values internally. And I know a lot of our courses here teach this same concept, that we have to first develop our value statement. So getting that written down so it can be adopted and approved by the board is going to give us a working policy to use as a framework for our decision making. So when we think about what the org wants to emphasize, what their core values represent, what they want to focus in their most important areas and what they want to see improvement on, we know that we want to be decisive in those things and developing those things and taking the time. So when we're in the nonprofit sector, we're counting on people basically giving us and volunteering us their time. If they're on our board, they're typically unpaid positions, and people donate their time to be a part of our retreats and our decision making and run those things by. So developing a value statement might seem less important when we're dealing with like, this is what we have to get done, these are our fundraisers, but it's really important to making sure that everything goes on track in the day-to-day. So if we wanted to be innovative, if that was our value, right, we would want to make sure that we put that in our value statement. Or if we want to be a safe space for people to be themselves, we want that in our value statement. So we want to start with really broad ideas like ethics, accountability, and transparency, but we want to highlight any of the values that we want to permeate throughout the organization. That way they're already be written down, they're not open to discussion. And every time there's a decision to make, we can look back at our value statement and discuss like, will that uphold the values of our organization, the things we're trying to be at our core? And then lastly, our value statement has to be one that everyone can live with, right? So your values are going to drive our policies and rules. So those things need to be enforceable. To not live by or enforce our values is going to make us a disingenuous organization. And to me, that's unethical. We want to be authentic and genuine, right? So the internal values of the organization aren't going to be effective for us if we just talk about them. So, or if we put them on a poster and hang them on the wall or have them like on the cover page of the employee handbook. We've all seen, even in the for-profit sector, everybody's got a policy. It doesn't really matter if it doesn't permeate the organization, right? So what makes them effective is using them every day. when we put them in our job descriptions, when we talk about them in our interviews, when we train our staff, when we integrate them into our annual evaluations, all of that is the kind of ways that we can start at the beginning and keep utilizing them throughout our policies and procedures. And something that if my students are looking for work at a nonprofit, I want them to be looking for. I want them to look for ones that have strong values that are communicating that up front. I want them to know what to expect, what they're going to get with the organization, not just what their mission is, but what values they're communicating about their culture. If you want to be at an organization that values high quality work, you're going to look for that in their values. If you want to be at an organization that values personal growth and mentorship, then you're going to want to look for that. Or if you want one, that's really innovative or space or a safe space, then those are the things that they're looking for. So when a company is willing to put those things out there and go public with them, we should expect those things are the standards of not just how you're going to be held as an employee, but also your bosses and your colleagues, and everyone's going to be operating within the same framework. And then once those things are internally incorporated, we want to make sure those things are public, putting them on our website and multiple places where appropriate. If we're looking for volunteers, make sure to highlight your values. You want a donation, highlight your values. Describing your services, use the language of your values, right? Holding those up high and out loud so that those around you, inside and outside of your organization, can really see what you're about, what they're contributing to, what they're giving their money to, and as well as if they want to be a part of that. So we have a lot of donor turnover in the nonprofit sector. We get people to come, they get excited about it, and then they might fall away. It's not uncommon, but if we're out front with our values, that means that we're probably attracting the people that are attracted to the same things we are. We're going in the same direction already, and retention is going to be easier for us, even from a funding standpoint. So doing all of these things should help us really have our staff, volunteers, and our board on living by these values and a part of the bigger picture together, creating a strong team for the organization. We also talked about in this course, we wanted to talk about being accountable, taking responsibility for our actions and choices. So a lot of times these days, even in those headlines we saw on the previous slides, everyone's trying to point the finger at someone else when something goes wrong. So much like building any skill set, you have to have a pattern of taking responsibility on the little things day by day. So if we are able to take responsibility for our little slip-ups, take ownership when we're held accountable by others and say, hey, I'm sorry, my bad, like it won't happen again, even if it's not a big deal, then that's building the muscle that we need to be able to demonstrate accountability in the most difficult situations. We can't expect people to just take responsibility for big things if they can't even do it on the little things. So within our nonprofit organizations, it's really important that leadership is able to set this example for what this looks like. So if the ED or the CEO can't model being held accountable for the rest of the org, then how can they expect their staff to be held accountable? You can't expect something from someone else that you can't really lead first with. So leaders have to step up and lead through errors. They have to be accountable to the board in the case of nonprofits, or managers to employees, and then adjust moving forward. So no one's going to be perfect, right? Everybody's going to slip up. And so if we try and pretend like our leaders are perfect and exude perfection, people are going to do one of two things. So number one, they're either going to lose respect because they know it's not true. Like internally, we all know that person, sorry, is not perfect all the time. Or we're going to be too afraid that we're not going to achieve perfection. And that's when we start to make other poor, unethical decisions, right? When we're faced with difficult decisions and we have to please our leaders or our managers or our executive team or our board of directors, if we think they only expect certain results or perfection, that might lead us to taking shortcuts, cutting corners, making decisions that aren't what's best for the organization and can cost us in the long run. So accountability was a really core tenet of something that we talked about here in class. In order to be accountable, we talked about how to do that we have to start at the beginning of the process, not just inside the organization to outside, but how do we do that in our processes? So we have to be accountable to our funders when the money comes in the door. We have to steward those funds wisely, budget it appropriately, and provide a quality service for our beneficiaries. So without all of those steps, we can lose our donors, we can lose our funders. But another part of being accountable as an organization is setting measurable goals and outcomes. So a lot of times in nonprofit sectors, we see folks, paint this lovely picture of what they want to accomplish, but how do we know that they're actually doing that? We want to be accountable to accomplishing our mission, setting goals that we can accomplish and measure. So we don't want to just measure like our activities. We don't want to say like, hey, we're going to give out 400 lunches a day. That's lovely. But what's the point of the lunches? What outcome are we hoping to achieve? Is it food security? Is it people's health and wellness on the rise because they're not starving? What's the long-term measure of impact that we want to be doing at a higher level, so we can see if those things are actually accomplishing what we want them to accomplish, or do we need to do something different? If we care about people in the workplace, maybe meals are the way we get people to work, because you can't go to work and be productive if you're hungry. Same as kids in school, right? Maybe if the goal is food security, a meal is a simple way to do that. But if we only do it once a week, maybe we're not accomplishing that. So unless we're measuring those things, we can't actually know. So we want people to know what we're trying to accomplish. And that's not just going to be about internal accountability, but external as well. So our public can be aware of what we're promising to achieve, not just what we're doing day to day, if that makes sense. We also talked about our last step of creating an ethical culture at a nonprofit, about being transparent. So when we're successful, even when we fail to meet our goals, we want to be transparent, whether it's good or bad or otherwise. Being transparent means, that we have that accountability in place, and we are taking people with us on this journey. So we do have some watchdog websites out there that collect basic information about nonprofits. So they're already being forced to some degree to be transparent, but you can go in there as an organization and add to that information or share additional information about the organization that you're a part of. You can also put these things on your website consistently with data. You can push out newsletters that inform your stakeholders, not just about our successes, but about our challenges. That's one of the best ways, I think, to make people feel like they're part of the organization and what's being accomplished, is to say like, hey, we got these great things done, yay, but also this is really challenging. Can you help us? It didn't go the way we wanted to. And that really lets people see not only that, you're working on something that's really difficult. Again, these are huge social dilemmas in society. So we can't expect to always be like, oh, we did this great thing and it only cost $50 a month. We want to tell our donors the real and be transparent about that, for sustainability, for health, and for ethics. So all of those things help us build trust. And that's important here. So at a minimum, we've got some documents and things that we should have on our website. We should be transparent about if you have them. Some small organizations don't have them, but you should have all of these things listed, posted, and as public as possible. Lastly, what I want to talk about is resolving ethical dilemmas in nonprofits. So as mentioned and displayed here, nonprofits can make the news for a myriad of ethical issues. Some that often arise that the organizations have to consider here are the ones up here on the screen for you. So things like accountability. Nonprofit organizations have special tax obligation to the public to be accountable for the results of their activities that justify their tax-exempt status. So the board of directors here is ultimately responsible for ensuring that the organization's values are not compromised and that the funds are directed towards achieving the results. These are the categories, right, that we see these dilemmas in. We see categories within the conflict of interest. So anytime the organization's resources are directed towards an individual or individuals who can have a say in how these resources are spent, that would be a conflict of interest. So for example, if we have an organization that's leasing office space owned by a family member, that would be a conflict of interest. It doesn't mean that that's not in the best interest of the organization. Like that person could be leasing it to us for a discounted rate. But what's important here is that the issue is transparent, that the conflict is known, and that the person that would benefit from the arrangement, if they're on the board, would need to recuse him or herself from the vote or decision. Sometimes we have issues in the area of disclosures, and that's again really about transparency here. So who should have access to what information? Obviously, following the IRS rules is important, and certain information there must be disclosed. But oftentimes, organizations choose to market their services in a way that appeals to donors, but isn't in fact really true to how the money is being used. And if anybody follows some of the larger nonprofits in my sector, we saw that with the Kiva example, people marketing their services in one way, and that's what's not really happening, and they didn't really disclose what's happening. So when people do find out, they get really upset. Sometimes we have issues with accumulation of surpluses. So when we talk about how our orgs need to budget and save, we want to have reserves to weather a storm. So if there's a pandemic or a downturn, or we can't hold our yearly fundraiser or gala, like, we can weather it, right? But if an organization is accumulating a surplus of larger than 3 times the current year's expenses, that's something we want to talk about. We want to disclose to our donors so they know what they're giving to and why you need that surplus. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's unethical or illegal to do so. But again, if we're not transparent about it and we don't open up to, like, here's why we're doing this, we think in the future this is going to be a change or that, then we could get caught up in a dilemma there. We also have issues like outside remuneration. So it's not uncommon for staff to be paid for other jobs or contracts outside of the organization. Sometimes EDs are offered stipends to speak at events or take on consulting roles. Pay that comes from outside of the organization to an individual. So the issue here is, should the staff turn that fee over to the org? If you're talking about the organization and your work with it, where does that funding go? Does it go to the individual or go to the organization? So again, doesn't mean that it's necessarily illegal or unethical to do it one way or the other, but organizations need to have a policy in place for when these issues arise. So we don't want to exploit the knowledge of the organization for personal gain, but we also don't want to exploit someone's time for organizational gain. Another area here is salaries, benefits, and perks. So ethically, the organization needs to set our salaries to treat each person with dignity. That's really what it comes down to, is paying a decent standard of living, providing some basic benefits, and a rate that makes sense based on the organization's size and complexity and job duties of the person, right? So it would be unethical for us to pay too little to our employees because we want to spend every dollar on programs. The mission matters, but if we're doing it at the expense of people within the organization, that comes back to, like, is it just, is it fair, is it ethical? Just as much as it would be unethical for us to pay too much for our director's salary, how much money they raise versus the mission they accomplish. All the ways people get paid within nonprofits can lead to ethical dilemmas and questions that should be addressed up front. So one thing I've learned in this sector is always better to over communicate rather than under communicate, and make sure everybody's on the same page. And lastly, personal relationships. So when people come together to achieve a mission, it's not uncommon for us to forge friendships. It's not uncommon for your board to be friends with your employees or your directors, because you're all excited, obviously, about the same thing, right? So that's okay, but we want to make sure that nepotism is prohibited, and we try to keep our friendships from influencing our professional judgment. So again, having those conversations ahead of time, having some policies and procedures in place, and disclosing those issues when they arise is the best way to stave off some kind of fraud or scandal or unethical decision-making. So when we're trying to make a decision, regardless of the choice you make, usually there's at least like one ethical principle that we're going to find being violated. And although those situations are bound to arise, we want to handle them in a highly ethical manner to the best of our ability. So at the end of the ethics module that I did with students, I posed a couple of questions to them that I would love for us to discuss as well, time permitting. And talk about some of the challenges and questions that we have there. Does anybody have a comment about the first one? Should nonprofits be held to a higher ethical standard than a for-profit sector firm? Do you think we should have more rules in place for them? Why or why not? It looks like everyone's unmuted.
Oh, hello.
Oh, it's just my name.
So I think that nonprofits should be held to a higher ethical standard, although realistically, a business should operate above the board no matter what, whether it's for profit or not for profit. But ultimately, the point of a for-profit business is to bring in money for a personal gain. Whereas, nonprofits normally, they're providing a service back to the community, to society. So the stakeholder interest, I think, is very different. So although I'd like to say, yeah, that it shouldn't be held to a higher ethical standard, I think in reality, we do need to place an emphasis on that for nonprofits.
Awesome, thanks. Anybody else have any comments here?
I have one. I mean, when I teach this type of thing and people look at the ethics of an organization, we have a lot of nonprofit organizations in Colorado Springs, and oftentimes they find out they don't have any kind of ethical organization type of information because they are they're already doing good things. And so they feel like they don't have to be held to a high, that they have to have an ethics program available.
I think that's true. It's really interesting because I think that's the tension. That's the crux of it, is like, we're trying to accomplish good things. So naturally, I think it attracts people who believe in justice, who believe in high ethical standards already. And yet those things are typically not in place at all. And it's where you value. I feel like everybody values something differently. So if you value the fact that you want to provide health services to patients, low-income patients, or that everybody deserves access to healthcare options, that's great. But if you don't provide health benefits to your employees within your organization, is that consistent? We keep our eyes so focused on like these people over here that we might ignore the thing that's closer to us. What do you guys think? Anybody else have a comment here?
I was just thinking that it's not so much that that there should be a distinguished standard between the two. Like, everybody should be, practicing higher ethical standards no matter where they're working or what kind of business they're running. But it's the degree to which those principles apply, right? So in a corporate setting, a for-profit setting, there are a lot of safeguards and built-in accountability and those kinds of things that are already in place. Where in a nonprofit, maybe there needs to be more of a pointed effort to put those things in place based on ethical practice. And so, I don't know if I'm explaining it the way that I'm thinking about it, but yeah, I'm just thinking, so it's not so much it's a standard, it's just more of, maybe there's more ethical focus on certain principles because they're not organically a part of a nonprofit, where in some places, like in a for-profit setting, they are, if that makes sense.
Do you think, as you're talking, I'm thinking, like, do you think that who each type of organization appeals to comes into play? Like, I feel like nonprofits appeal to people who are, everybody's personality type and skill set is different. And I want to say this might be an overgeneralization, but that nonprofit work typically might apply or appeal to people who are more motivated by like the warm fuzzies. And maybe that in and of itself kind of leads to some of those differences that you're talking about.
I mean, it could be, but then if you look at the other side of where people become very fraudulent or mishandle and misuse the nonprofit, you've got individuals that take advantage of that and they go into it for that reason. And so, yeah, it could be either way. Yeah.
What I don't see in nonprofits is people like intentionally, mind you, the big headline news ones, like I'm not intimately connected to those. But I don't see people intentionally being unethical. They just think they can justify it. Well, I didn't get paid for this. I don't make the rate for this. So I'll just justify that that's okay. The company can make it up to me because they paid for this or that, or I borrowed free product from the company or whatever it is, I feel like people just, they don't enter it to set out to be unethical or take advantage. In my experience, it just kind of is one of those slippery slope things that we talked about in another ethics session, Tracy. We talked about leaders that end up in jail, I think, and CEOs that end up and how they get there. And they always say, well, I did this, but it wasn't as bad as that guy. And they compare themselves and kind of justify that way. And I feel like I see that in nonprofits a lot. Well, I don't
thank
really
you.
get paid, so.
Great discussions, and we can continue this after offline. I just do want to bring it to a close because we are to the point of our time, and this is great discussions. And I like your ideas of it shows that you asked them to actually think about if they write a book and to actually look at the nonprofit scandals. Great approaches. But I do want to thank everyone for attending, and we will be able to share these slides and hopefully a recording. And just want to thank everyone for contributing.